The gunshot wound in his shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat as Ryder Vance struggled to stay upright in his saddle, the horizon before him tilting dangerously as blood soaked through his once white shirt. Wyoming Territory, 1875, was unforgiving to men on the run, especially as the sun began its descent behind the distant mountains, bathing the plains in an orange glow that matched the fire of his pain. Becky Turner wiped her brow with the back of her hand as she hauled the last bucket of water from the well to her modest homestead on the outskirts of Hays City, Kansas. At 24, she had grown accustomed to the solitude that came with managing her late father's ranch alone, save for the aging ranch hand who helped with the cattle but lived in town. The setting sun cast long shadows across her property, signaling the end of another day of hard work and quiet determination. She was just about to close her front door when she heard the unsteady rhythm of hooves approaching, followed by a dull thud and a groan that was unmistakably human. Becky grabbed her father's shotgun from beside the door, a precaution she'd learned was necessary for a woman living alone in these parts. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady despite the fear creeping up her spine. When no answer came, she cautiously stepped onto her porch, shotgun raised. There, sprawled at the bottom of her 3 wooden steps, lay a man face down in the dirt. His horse stood nearby, reins dragging on the ground, its sides heaving from what must have been a hard ride. "Mister?" Becky approached carefully, keeping the shotgun aimed. "Can you hear me?" The stranger groaned again, weakly trying to push himself up before collapsing back into the dirt. Becky noticed the dark stain spreading across his shoulder and back, blood, far too much of it. Her caution gave way to compassion as she set the shotgun aside and knelt beside him. "You're hurt bad," she said, gently rolling him over. His face was handsome despite being covered in trail dust, and Payne's strong jaw now clenched tight, straight nose, and eyes that flickered open to reveal a startling blue color that reminded Becky of the summer sky. "Help," he managed before his eyes rolled back and he lost consciousness again. Becky knew she couldn't leave him to die on her doorstep, regardless of who he was or what trouble might be following him. With determination born of years of ranch work, she hooked her arms under his and began the laborious task of dragging him inside. By the time she got him to her bed, her arms ached and sweat plastered her dark brown hair to her forehead. The stranger remained unconscious as she cut away his bloodied shirt to reveal the bullet wound that had torn through his left shoulder. "What have you gotten yourself into, cowboy?" she murmured, hurrying to fetch her medical supplies, alcohol, clean cloths, and the surgical kit her father had left behind from his army days. The wound was clean through, which was fortunate, though the bleeding concerned her. Becky steeled herself and began the process of cleaning and bandaging, skills she'd learned helping her father tend to injured ranch hands. As she worked, she noticed the calluses on his hands, a working man's hands, and the way his face, even in unconsciousness, seemed to hold a certain kindness. His dark hair, too long for a proper gentleman but fitting for a cowboy, curled slightly where it wasn't matted with sweat. "You just hold on," she told him, though she knew he couldn't hear. "I'm not letting you die in my bed, stranger." It was well past midnight when she finished tending to him, setting up a chair beside the bed to keep watch. Fever would be the next battle, she knew, and she prepared cool compresses and brewed willow bark tea to have ready when he woke. The night passed slowly, with Becky fighting sleep as she monitored her patient. Dawn was breaking when the stranger finally stirred, his eyes opening with confusion that quickly turned to alarm. "Easy now," Becky said, placing a firm hand on his good shoulder to keep him from sitting up. "You've been shot and you'll tear open my careful stitching if you start thrashing about." "Where?" he croaked, his voice rough from disuse. "You're at my ranch about 5 miles outside of Hays City," she answered, reaching for a cup of water. "I'm Becky Turner." "You collapsed at my door last night, bleeding like a stuck pig." She helped him take a small sip of water, which he accepted gratefully. "Ryder," he managed. "Ryder Vance." "Well, Mr. Vance, you're lucky to be alive. That bullet missed anything vital, but you lost a lot of blood." He seemed to process this information slowly, his eyes taking in the clean, modest room around him. "Thank you," he said finally. "Not many would help a stranger." "I'm not in the habit of letting men die on my doorstep," Becky replied with a slight smile. "Can you tell me what happened?" "Should I be expecting whoever shot you to come looking?" A shadow crossed his face. "No," he said after a moment. "It was a misunderstanding in Dodge City. The man who shot me, he won't be following." Something in his tone told Becky there was more to the story, but she didn't press. "Everyone in these parts had secrets, herself included. You need rest," she said instead, standing up. "And I need to tend to my chores. I'll bring you some broth later if you're feeling up to it." As she turned to leave, his hand caught hers weakly, but with purpose. "Why help me?" "You don't know me." Becky looked down at his hand on hers, warm despite his ordeal. "Because my father taught me that's what decent folks do," she said simply. "Now rest, Mr. Vance. You've got a lot of healing ahead." She gently extracted her hand from his and left the room, trying to ignore the strange flutter in her chest at his touch. It had been a long time since she'd had a man in her house, let alone one in her bed, even if the circumstances were far from romantic. Outside, she leaned against the wall of her house and took a deep breath of the morning air. She had cattle to tend, eggs to collect, and now a wounded cowboy to nurse back to health. Whatever trouble he'd brought to her doorstep would have to wait. Over the next 3 days, Ryder drifted in and out of consciousness as fever took hold. Becky did her best to keep it at bay, applying cool compresses to his forehead and forcing him to drink water and broth when he was lucid enough. During his fevered ramblings, she learned bits and pieces about him. He'd grown up in Texas, had a younger sister he'd lost to fever years ago, and had been working cattle drives since he was 16. He was 30 now, or so he claimed in one of his more coherent moments. On the 4th morning, Becky entered the bedroom with fresh bandages to find Ryder awake and alert, his color much improved. "Good morning," she said, setting her supplies on the bedside table. "You look better." "Feel better," he replied, his voice stronger than it had been. "Though I reckon I've been a terrible burden on you." "Nothing I couldn't handle," Becky assured him as she began to unwrap his old bandage. "Your fever broke last night. I was starting to worry we might need to fetch the doctor from town." Ryder winced as the bandage pulled at his healing wound. "I'm glad you didn't. Doctors ask too many questions." Becky paused, studying his face. "And you're a man with something to hide, Mr. Vance." He met her gaze steadily. "Aren't we all, Miss Turner?" She couldn't argue with that. Everyone who came west had left something behind. For some, it was just poverty or boredom, but for others, it was law or heartache or worse. "Your wound is healing well," she said, changing the subject as she applied a fresh bandage. "Another week or so and you'll be well enough to ride, I expect." Something like disappointment flickered in his eyes, but he nodded. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. As soon as I can sit a horse without passing out, I'll be on my way." "There's no rush," Becky said, surprising herself with her reluctance to see him go. "Winter's coming on and work around here slows down. It's no trouble to have you stay until you're fully healed." "That's kind of you," Ryder said, catching her hand as she finished with the bandage. "But I should tell you I'm not exactly welcome in some parts. The man I had a disagreement with in Dodge City was well connected." Is, he corrected quickly. "He is well connected. I just mean I'd hate to bring trouble to your door." Becky withdrew her hand gently. "Mr. Vance, this is the frontier. Trouble finds its way to every door eventually." "At least this way I'd see it coming." He smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed his face and made her heart skip a beat. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Turner. Just practical," she replied, gathering her supplies to hide her flushing cheeks. "Rest now. I'll bring you something more substantial to eat later. You need to build your strength." As the days passed, Ryder grew stronger. By the end of the week, he was able to sit up in bed without assistance, and Becky found herself enjoying their conversations over meals. He told her of his years driving cattle from Texas to the railheads in Kansas, of the characters he'd met along the way, and the sights he'd seen across the Western territories. In turn, she shared stories of her life coming west with her father after her mother died, learning to run a ranch at a young age, and her determination to keep it going after her father's passing 2 years prior. "It can't be easy," Ryder said one evening as they shared a simple supper of rabbit stew at her small table, which he'd insisted on joining rather than eating in bed. "A woman alone running a cattle ranch. It isn't," Becky admitted. "But this land was my father's dream, and now it's mine. I hire help when I need it for roundup and branding, and old Jim Barnes comes by 3 days a week to help with the heavier work. We manage. Still, it's a lot for one person," Ryder persisted. "Most women would have sold up or found a husband to take over by now." Becky's expression cooled slightly. "I'm not most women, Mr. Vance, and I don't need a husband to validate my existence or run my ranch." Ryder raised his hands in surrender, wincing slightly at the pull on his injured shoulder. "I meant no offense. I admire your independence. It's refreshing." Her expression softened. "I'm sorry. I've had that conversation too many times with too many well-meaning townspeople who think a woman has no business doing what I do." "Their loss," Ryder said with a smile. "This is the best rabbit stew I've had in years." The tension broken, they continued their meal, though Becky couldn't help noticing the way Ryder's eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her that way, not as a curiosity or a business opportunity, but as a woman. The next morning, Ryder insisted on helping with the chores, despite Becky's protests. "Your shoulder needs time to heal," she argued as he pulled on one of her father's old shirts that she'd given him, his own having been ruined by blood and her scissors. "And my mind needs something to do besides count the knots in your ceiling," he countered. "I promise I won't do anything that strains my shoulder. Just let me help with the eggs or feeding the chickens something to earn my keep." Unable to deny the logic or the earnest look in his eyes, Becky relented. "Fine. But you stay within sight of the house, and the moment you feel tired, you stop. Deal?" "Yes, madam," he agreed with a mock salute. Despite her concerns, Ryder proved to be good company as they worked. He had a natural way with animals, speaking softly to her skittish chickens as he scattered feed, and her normally suspicious farm dog, Buck, had taken to following him around like they were old friends. "You've got a way with creatures," Becky observed as they sat on her porch later that afternoon, taking a break from the day's work. Ryder stroked Buck's head, which rested on his knee. "Animals are simple. They don't judge or hold grudges. They just want food, shelter, and a little kindness." "Not so different from people when you get down to it," Becky mused. "Maybe," Ryder said, his expression growing distant, "but people have a way of complicating things. Animals don't lie or betray." There was a story there, Becky knew, but she didn't pry. Everyone had wounds that weren't visible, and sometimes those took longer to heal than bullet holes. As October gave way to November, the air grew colder, and Ryder's presence on the ranch became almost normal. His shoulder had healed enough that he could help with most chores, though he still favored his right arm. They fell into a comfortable routine, working together during the day, sharing meals and conversation in the evenings, and parting ways at night with Ryder sleeping on a pallet in the main room while Becky reclaimed her bedroom. She found herself looking forward to their evenings together when the work was done and they could sit by the fire. Sometimes they played cards or checkers. Other times, Ryder would read aloud from one of the few books Becky owned. His deep voice brought the stories to life in a way that made her see them anew. It was during one such evening, with the first snow of the season falling gently outside, that Becky finally asked the question that had been on her mind since the night he arrived. "What really happened in Dodge City, Ryder?" He looked up from the book in his hands, his expression guarded. "You sure you want to know?" "I think I've earned the right to know what kind of trouble might come looking for you for us," she said firmly. Ryder closed the book and set it aside, staring into the fire for a long moment before speaking. "I was working as a trail boss, bringing cattle up from Texas for a rancher named Hollister. Good job, good pay. When we reached Dodge, the men got their wages and headed to town to spend it, as cowboys do. I was supposed to collect our payment from the buyer and head back south." He paused, and Becky waited patiently, knowing he needed to tell this at his own pace. The buyer was a man named Fletcher Reed, big cattle broker with connections to the railroad. When I went to collect, he tried to shortchange us, claimed our herd was underweight and not worth what we'd agreed on. I knew he was lying. I'd weighed those cattle myself before we set out. Ryder's jaw tightened at the memory. We argued. Things got heated. He pulled a gun, said he'd teach me a lesson about respect. I reacted, knocked the gun away, but it went off. The bullet hit one of his men who was standing nearby. Did it kill him? Becky asked quietly. No, but it could have. Reed was furious, claimed I'd attacked them unprovoked. His man would back up whatever story Reed told, and suddenly I was facing a murder charge for defending myself. So I ran. Reed's men caught up with me outside of town. There was a shootout. I took a bullet but managed to wound two of them badly enough that they couldn't follow. And you rode all the way to my ranch? Becky asked, calculating the distance. That's nearly 200 miles, Ryder nodded. 3 days in the saddle, stopping only when I had to. I knew I needed to get far away from Dodge. I was aiming for Denver, but by the time I reached your place, I was barely conscious. Do you think they're still looking for you? Reed isn't the type to forget a slight, Ryder said grimly, but it's been over a month and winter's coming on. They might wait until spring to pick up my trail if they haven't already given up. Becky absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the dangerous fugitive he described with the gentle, hard-working man who'd been sharing her home. You're not a killer, she said finally. It wasn't a question. No, he agreed, but that doesn't mean I haven't done things I regret. The frontier doesn't always give men clean choices. No, Becky echoed, thinking of her own difficult decisions since her father's death. It doesn't. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. I should move on soon, Ryder said eventually. It's not fair to bring this trouble to your door. Winter's nearly here, Becky pointed out. The passes will be snowed in within weeks. Even if you wanted to leave, it wouldn't be safe. All the more reason I should go now, before the snow gets too deep. Becky felt a surge of panic at the thought of him leaving. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to having someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who looked at her and really saw her. Stay, she said, more forcefully than she'd intended. At least until spring. No one's going to be looking for you in the dead of winter, and I could use the help with the cattle when the real snows come. Ryder studied her face, his expression unreadable. Are you sure, Becky? Having me here puts you at risk. I'm sure, she said, meeting his gaze steadily. This ranch is remote enough that casual travelers don't pass by, and I can handle anyone who comes asking questions. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I believe you could at that. Then it's settled, Becky said, standing up to bank the fire for the night. You'll stay until spring, help with the winter work, and we'll reassess when the snow melts. As she turned to head to her bedroom, Ryder caught her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth up her arm. Thank you, he said simply, for everything. Becky squeezed his hand once before letting go. Good night, Ryder. Good night, Becky. As she closed her bedroom door behind her, Becky leaned against it, her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with fear of what trouble might find them, and everything to do with the man sleeping just beyond her door. The winter settled in earnest over the next few weeks, blanketing the plains in snow and keeping them largely isolated from town. Ryder proved invaluable during this time, helping to keep the livestock fed and watered despite the freezing temperatures, and making repairs to the barn and corral that Becky had been putting off. Christmas approached, and despite their isolation, Becky was determined to observe the holiday properly. She rode into Hays City a week before, returning with small treats, oranges, candy sticks, and coffee beans along with fabric for a new shirt she planned to make for Ryder as a gift. Ryder, for his part, disappeared into the workshop behind the barn for hours at a time, refusing to let her see what he was working on. Christmas surprise was all he would say when she asked, a boyish grin on his face that made him look younger than his 30 years. On Christmas Eve, they shared a special dinner of roast rabbit and the last of Becky's preserved vegetables from her garden. Ryder had found a small pine tree on the property and brought it inside, and they decorated it with paper chains they'd made together on a snowy afternoon. My mother always insisted on a proper Christmas, even when times were lean. Becky explained as they sat by the fire after dinner, nursing cups of coffee laced with a splash of whiskey that Ryder had somehow procured from his mysterious trips to the workshop. After she died, my father kept up the tradition for my sake. My family was never much for celebrating, Ryder admitted. My pa was more likely to be drunk than festive, and after he left, my ma was too busy trying to keep food on the table to worry about holidays. That's a shame, Becky said softly. Every child deserves some magic in their life. Ryder's eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. I think I'm finding some of that magic a bit late in life. The look that passed between them was charged with unspoken feelings, but Becky broke it first, rising to fetch the package she'd wrapped in brown paper and string. It's not much, she said, handing it to him, but Merry Christmas, Ryder. He accepted the gift with a look of genuine surprise, as if he hadn't expected anything despite their earlier talk of presents. Carefully, he unwrapped it to reveal the dark blue shirt she'd sewn, the fabric sturdy but soft. Becky, this is. He ran his fingers over the neat stitching. No one's made something for me like this since I was a boy. I noticed your old one was getting threadbare, she said, suddenly shy, and blue suits you, brings out your eyes. Thank you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I'll treasure it. He set the shirt aside carefully and stood, going to his own hiding place behind a loose board in the wall where he kept his few possessions. From it, he withdrew a small package wrapped in a clean bandana. For you, he said, returning to hand it to her. Though it's not nearly as fine as what you've given me. Becky unwrapped the bandana to find a beautifully carved wooden box, small enough to fit in her palm. The lid was inlaid with a design of wildflowers, each petal and leaf delicately rendered. Ryder, it's beautiful, she breathed, running her finger over the smooth surface. Open it, he encouraged. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a silver locket. It was simple but elegant, with a scrolling pattern etched into its surface. I traded some work for old Mrs. Wilson in town for it, Ryder explained, looking almost nervous. She said it had been her mother's. I thought, well, you might like to keep a memento of your parents in it. Tears pricked at Becky's eyes as she opened the locket to find it empty, waiting for whatever memories she chose to place inside. This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed a kiss to his cheek. Thank you. When she pulled back, Ryder was looking at her with such intensity that it stole her breath. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb gently brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Becky, he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and she knew with sudden clarity that she wanted him to. But instead he dropped his hand and took a step back. It's getting late, he said, his voice strained, and tomorrow's still a working day, Christmas or no. Of course, Becky agreed, trying to hide her disappointment. Good night, Ryder, and thank you again for the beautiful gifts. That night, as she lay in bed clutching the locket, Becky admitted to herself what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling in love with Ryder Vance. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She'd sworn after her father died that she would never depend on anyone else, that she would make her own way in the world without leaning on a man for support. But Ryder didn't make her feel dependent, he made her feel stronger, as if together they could face whatever challenges came their way. And yet, he was still a man with a past, a man who by spring might ride away and never look back. January brought the harshest weather of the season, with blizzards that kept them confined to the house for days at a time. They passed the hours reading, playing cards, and talking about everything and nothing, their childhood dreams and adult disappointments. During one such storm, with the wind howling outside and snow piling against the windows, Ryder asked about the photograph on her mantel, a stern-looking man in Union Army uniform standing beside a pretty woman in a dark dress. My parents on their wedding day, Becky explained. My father was home on leave during the war. They had known each other since childhood, but only married when he thought he might not come back. But he did come back, Ryder observed. Yes, though not the same man who left. The war changed him, made him quieter, more determined to make something of his life. She touched the frame gently. That's why we came west after my mother died. He said he needed open spaces and a fresh start. He raised a remarkable daughter, Ryder said, his eyes warm as they met hers. He must have been proud of you. I hope so, Becky said softly. What about your parents? You've mentioned your mother, but you rarely speak of your father. A shadow crossed Ryder's face. Not much to tell. He was a drunkard who beat my mother and disappeared when I was 12. Last I heard, he died in a bar fight somewhere in Oklahoma Territory. I'm sorry, Becky said, instinctively reaching for his hand. Don't be, Ryder said, though he didn't pull his hand away. His leaving was the best thing he ever did for us. My mother was free of his fists, and I learned early what kind of man I didn't want to become. Is that why you're so gentle? Becky asked. I've seen you with the animals, even with that ornery old rooster that attacks everyone else. You never lose your temper. Ryder's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand, sending shivers up her arm. I made a promise to myself a long time ago that I'd never raise my hand in anger, not to an animal and certainly not to a woman. There's been enough violence in my life without adding to it. Becky studied his face, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years in the sun, the straight nose that had probably been broken at least once. Despite the hard life he'd lived, there was a fundamental kindness in his features that drew her to him. Yet you've been in fights, she observed. Those knuckles have seen their share of action. He glanced down at his free hand, the scarred knuckles evidence of a fighter's past. I've never started a fight, he said quietly, but I've finished my share. Sometimes a man doesn't have a choice. Like in Dodge City, he agreed. Though I've been thinking about that a lot lately, maybe I could have handled it differently, found another way that didn't end with me on the run and a bullet in my shoulder. What would you have done differently? Becky asked, curious. Ryder was silent for a moment, considering. I might have gone to the sheriff first before confronting Reed, or gathered witnesses who could verify the weight of the cattle. There are usually alternatives to violence if a man takes time to look for them. That's wisdom that comes with age, Becky said with a small smile. My father used to say he wished he could go back and tell his younger self all the things he'd learned the hard way. What would you tell your younger self? Ryder asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. Becky thought about it. I'd tell her that strength doesn't mean having to do everything alone, that accepting help isn't the same as being weak. Is that something you still struggle with? Ryder's question was gentle but probing. Sometimes, Becky admitted. After my father died, so many people in town assumed I would sell the ranch or find a husband to run it. When I insisted on managing it myself, they thought I was being stubborn or foolish. I felt I had to prove them wrong, to never show any weakness or ask for help. Yet you helped me, Ryder pointed out. You didn't have to take in a bleeding stranger and nurse him back to health. That was different. How so? Becky struggled to articulate the feeling. You needed me. You weren't trying to take over or tell me what to do. You just needed help, and I could give it. Ryder's hand tightened around hers. I still need you, Becky, he said, his voice low and intense. More than I should. The atmosphere in the room changed, the air between them suddenly charged with possibility. Becky felt her heart racing as Ryder leaned closer, his intention clear in his eyes. This time, when his lips met hers, she didn't pull away. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, but when Becky responded, sliding her hands up to his shoulders, Ryder deepened it, pulling her closer with a soft groan. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ryder rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that for weeks, he confessed. What took you so long? Becky asked, surprised by her own boldness. Ryder laughed, a warm, rich sound that filled the room. Fear, I suppose, fear that you'd send me packing into that blizzard if I presumed too much. I might have, Becky admitted with a smile, a few weeks ago, but not now. And what's changed? He asked, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. Everything, Becky said simply, and nothing. I'm still me and you're still you, but together we're more. Ryder kissed her again, and Becky let herself be swept away by the feeling, by the rightness of being in his arms. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside their small home, they had found a warmth that could withstand any winter. As January gave way to February, their relationship deepened. Ryder moved his bedroll from the main room to Becky's bedroom, though they did nothing more than share kisses and hold each other through the cold nights. Both understood that they were building something precious, something neither wanted to rush. They talked about the future tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Ryder spoke of his dream to have his own ranch someday, a place where he could breed horses. Becky shared her plans to expand her herd come spring and possibly plant more crops if she could fence off the north pasture. "Why not combine our dreams?" Ryder suggested one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. February had brought milder weather, allowing them these moments outdoors. "Your cattle, my horses. This land has potential for both." "Are you proposing a business arrangement, Mr. Vance?" Becky asked, a teasing note in her voice though her heart had begun to pound. Ryder took her hand, his expression serious despite his smile. "I'm proposing whatever you'll accept, Miss Turner, business partnership." He hesitated, then added softly, "Marriage." Becky's breath caught. "Ryder, I know it's soon," he hurried on. "And I know I don't have much to offer except my hands and my heart, but I love you, Becky. I think I started falling for you that first day when you threatened me with a shotgun while I was bleeding on your doorstep." A laugh bubbled up through Becky's shock. "That's a strange beginning for a love story." "Maybe," Ryder agreed, bringing her hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "But it's our beginning, and I'd like to see where the story goes if you're willing." Becky looked into his eyes, those blue eyes that had first caught her attention when he was wounded and feverish, now clear and full of love. She thought about the months they'd spent together, how naturally he fit into her life, how much brighter her days were with him in them. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling right as soon as they left her lips. "And yes, I'm willing to see where our story goes, together." Ryder's face lit up with joy as he pulled her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of all the tomorrows they would share. That night, their relationship crossed the final threshold as they came together as husband and wife in all but name. Ryder's touch was gentle but sure, his hands and lips learning every inch of her body with reverent attention. Becky, who had never known a man's touch before, found herself responding with an instinctive passion that surprised and delighted them both. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Becky traced the scar on his shoulder where the bullet had entered the wound that had brought him to her. "I used to think it was bad luck that made my father choose this particular plot of land, so far from town and neighbors," she murmured. "Now I think it might have been fate. If we'd been closer to town, you might have found help there instead of collapsing on my doorstep." "Then I'm grateful for every mile between here and Hayes City," Ryder said, pressing a kiss to her forehead, "though I think I would have found you eventually." Some things are meant to be. As February waned, they began making plans in earnest. They would marry officially in the spring, once the roads were clear enough for the circuit preacher to visit. Ryder would use his savings to buy a few quality horses to start his breeding program, while Becky would manage the cattle operation they already had in place. Their happiness was so complete that Becky almost forgot about the trouble that had brought Ryder to her in the first place. But reality intruded one crisp March morning when Becky returned from town with supplies and news. "There were strangers asking questions at the general store," she told Ryder as they unpacked her purchases. 3 men, well-dressed but rough-looking. They were showing a sketch around, asking if anyone had seen the man it depicted. Ryder's hands stilled on the bag of flour he was lifting. "Did you see the sketch?" Becky nodded, her expression grim. "It was you, Ryder. A good likeness, too. They're saying you're wanted for murder in Dodge City." "Murder?" Ryder's face paled. "Reed's man didn't die. He was wounded, but he was alive when I left. According to these men, he took a turn for the worse and died 3 days later. They're offering a substantial reward for information leading to your capture." Ryder sank into a chair, running a hand through his hair. "Did anyone recognize me from the sketch?" "I don't think so," Becky said, sitting beside him and taking his hands in hers. "You haven't been to town since you arrived, and the sketch shows you clean-shaven. The beard helps." Unconsciously, Ryder touched the full beard he'd grown over the winter months. How did they track me this far? I was careful to stay off the main trails. They mentioned following reports of a wounded man who had paid for supplies with a distinctive silver watch in a settlement south of here in late October, Becky explained. They've been working their way north ever since, checking every town and homestead. My father's watch, Ryder muttered. I traded it for bandages and medicine when I realized how bad the wound was. I was afraid I wouldn't make it much farther without supplies. What do we do now? Becky asked, fear making her voice tight. Ryder was quiet for a long moment, his face troubled. I need to leave, he said finally. Tonight, before they expand their search beyond the town, if I head west into the mountains, no, Becky interrupted fiercely. I'm not letting you run again, not alone and not now. Becky, these men won't stop looking. Reed has money and influence. If they find me here, they'll arrest me for murder, and you could be charged as an accessory for harboring me. Then we'll face it together, Becky insisted. We'll go to the sheriff in Hayes City, tell him your side of the story. Reed's not the only one with influence. My father had friends in this county, respected men who would speak for us. It's not that simple, Ryder argued. It would be my word against Reed's, and he has witnesses who will say whatever he tells them to say. Then we'll find witnesses of our own, Becky countered. There must have been others in Dodge City that day who saw what really happened. Townspeople, other cowboys from your outfit, the cattle buyer who was supposed to pay you fairly. Ryder looked at her with a mixture of love and exasperation. You make it sound so easy. Not easy, Becky corrected, but possible. And certainly better than spending the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for Reed's men to find you. Our lives, Ryder repeated, catching on her words. Yes, our lives, Becky said firmly. Whatever you decide, wherever you go, I'm coming with you. We're in this together now, remember? The fierce determination in her eyes was matched only by the love shining there, and Ryder found himself nodding slowly. All right, he agreed. We'll try it your way. But if it doesn't work, if the sheriff won't listen or believes Reed's version, then we'll leave, Becky promised. Together, I can sell the ranch and we'll go somewhere they won't find us, California, Oregon, even Canada if we have to. Ryder pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. I don't deserve you, he murmured into her hair. Probably not, Becky agreed with a small laugh, but you're stuck with me anyway. The next morning they rode into Hayes City together, Becky with her head held high and Ryder beside her, his face grim but resolved. They went directly to the sheriff's office where they found Sheriff Dawson, a man Becky had known since childhood. Miss Turner, the sheriff greeted her with surprise. Didn't expect to see you in town again so soon, and who's this with you? This is Ryder Vance, Becky said, her voice steady despite her nervousness. My fiancé, we need to talk to you, Sheriff, about a serious matter. Sheriff Dawson's eyebrows rose, but he gestured them inside. Come on in then, coffee's hot if you want some. Once they were seated with steaming cups, Ryder told his story, the full truth about what had happened in Dodge City, the ambush afterward, and his flight across Kansas. I didn't know the man had died, Ryder finished, and I certainly didn't murder him. It was an accident during a struggle that Reed initiated. Sheriff Dawson listened without interruption, his weathered face giving nothing away. When Ryder finished, the sheriff leaned back in his chair, considering. That's quite a story, Mr. Vance, but it's your word against Fletcher Reed's, and he's a powerful man with the law on his side. We know that, Becky interjected, but there must be a way to prove Ryder's telling the truth. What about the other cowboys who were with him, or people in the saloon who saw the argument? Could help, the sheriff acknowledged. If you can find them and if they're willing to testify against Reed. Big ifs, Miss Turner. What about Jim Hollister? Ryder asked suddenly. The rancher I was working for. He's known Reed for years, knows he's not an honest businessman. He might have some influence. Sheriff Dawson scratched his chin thoughtfully. Hollister, you say? I know him by reputation, straight shooter from what I've heard. If he'd vouch for you, it might carry some weight. Could you send him a telegram? Becky asked eagerly. Ask him to come to Hayes City or at least provide a statement about Ryder's character. I could, the sheriff said slowly. But I should also tell you that those men who were asking questions yesterday, they're staying at the hotel in town, and they've been granted deputy status by the Dodge City Marshal. They have the authority to arrest you, Mr. Vance, and take you back to stand trial. Ryder tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. None of that now, Sheriff Dawson said sharply. I don't want trouble in my town, and pulling iron on lawmen, even temporary ones, won't help your case. What do you suggest we do, Sheriff? Becky asked, laying a restraining hand on Ryder's arm. The sheriff sighed, looking between them. I've known your family a long time, Miss Turner. Your father was a good man who helped build this town. For his sake, and because I've never known you to lie, I'm inclined to help if I can. Relief flooded through Becky. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, he cautioned. Here's what we'll do, Mr. Vance, you'll surrender to me now, officially. I'll hold you in my jail, which will satisfy those deputies that you're in custody. Meanwhile, I'll send telegrams to Hollister and to a judge I know in Topeka who might be willing to look into this matter properly. You want me to turn myself in? Ryder asked, his voice tight. It's your best chance, Sheriff Dawson said bluntly. Run now and you'll be running forever. Face this head-on with whatever help we can muster and you might just clear your name. Becky squeezed Ryder's hand. He's right, Ryder, and this way you'll be safe from those men while we figure things out. Ryder looked between them, conflict clear in his eyes. Finally, he nodded. All right. I'll do it your way, Sheriff, but I want your word that Becky won't be charged with anything for helping me. You have it, Sheriff Dawson promised. As far as anyone needs to know, Miss Turner only recently discovered your situation and brought you in as soon as she did. The next few days were the hardest of Becky's life. Ryder was kept in the small jail behind the sheriff's office, while Becky divided her time between the ranch and town, bringing him food and clean clothes, and checking on the progress of their plan. Sheriff Dawson had sent the telegrams as promised, and they received a swift reply from Jim Hollister, who expressed shock at the murder charge and promised to come to Hayes City as soon as possible. The judge in Topeka was slower to respond, but eventually agreed to review the case once they had gathered more evidence. The deputies from Dodge City were furious when they discovered that Ryder had surrendered to the local sheriff and demanded he be turned over to them for immediate transport back to Dodge. Sheriff Dawson, however, stood his ground. He's in my custody in my jurisdiction, and he'll stay here until we sort this matter out properly, the sheriff told them firmly. You're welcome to stay in town and observe, but he doesn't leave my jail without a proper hearing. The standoff might have turned ugly if not for the timely arrival of Jim Hollister, a burly, white-haired man with a reputation as solid as his handshake. He confirmed Ryder's character and the circumstances of the cattle sale, and even produced a telegram from the original buyer in Dodge City, who admitted, when pressed, that Reed had instructed him to shortchange Hollister's outfit. Reed's been pulling this scam for years, Hollister explained to the gathering in the sheriff's office, which now included the Dodge City deputies, the local judge, and several prominent citizens of Hayes City who had come to support Becky. He undercuts legitimate buyers, then cheats the drovers to maximize his profit. Most outfits just take the loss rather than challenge him, but Ryder here stood his ground. That still doesn't explain the dead man, one of the deputies argued. No, but this might, Sheriff Dawson said, producing a telegram that had just arrived. I took the liberty of contacting the doctor who treated Reed's man after the shooting. According to his statement here, the wound itself wasn't fatal. The man died from infection 3 days later after refusing proper medical treatment and continuing to drink heavily against advice. That's not murder, the local judge, a stern-faced man named Patterson, declared. At most, it's manslaughter due to reckless behavior during a dispute. And given the circumstances, Reed drawing his weapon first, and the death resulting from an accidental discharge during the struggle, even that charge seems excessive. The deputies from Dodge City protested, but their arguments grew weaker as more evidence emerged in Ryder's favor. Finally, Judge Patterson made his ruling. I find insufficient evidence to hold Mr. Vance on charges of murder. The charge is reduced to simple assault, for which he has effectively served his time during these weeks of incarceration and his previous injury. The judge looked sternly at Ryder. However, I would advise you to settle your differences with Mr. Reed through legal channels in the future. Yes, Your Honor, Ryder agreed, barely containing his relief. And as for you gentlemen, the judge continued, addressing the Dodge City deputies, I suggest you return to your jurisdiction and inform Mr. Reed that if he wishes to pursue this matter further, he should do so through proper legal channels, not by sending armed men to hunt down a man without due process. The deputies left Hays City the next day, clearly unhappy but unable to argue with the judge's decision. Ryder was released from jail, stepping out into the spring sunshine a free man. Becky was waiting for him, and he swept her into his arms, spinning her around before setting her back on her feet and kissing her soundly, heedless of the townsfolk watching and smiling. "It's over," he said when they finally broke apart. "Really over." "I told you we could do it together," Becky reminded him, her eyes shining with happiness and unshed tears. Jim Hollister approached them, his weathered face creased in a smile. "Well, Vance, seems you landed on your feet despite everything." "Thanks to you, sir," Ryder said, extending his hand to his former employer. "I owe you more than I can repay." Hollister shook his hand firmly. "Nonsense, you were always one of my best men, though I reckon I've lost any chance of hiring you back now." He glanced meaningfully at Becky. "Yes, sir, you have," Ryder agreed with a grin, slipping his arm around Becky's waist. "I've found something better than driving cattle across half of Texas." "Can't say I blame you," Hollister chuckled. "Well, if you two are planning to expand that ranch of yours, I might have a proposition for you. I'm looking to establish a breeding operation in Kansas, could use reliable partners who know the territory." Becky and Ryder exchanged surprised looks. "We'd be interested in hearing more," Becky said cautiously. Good. Let's discuss it over dinner before I head back south. My treat, of course." As Hollister walked away, Ryder turned to Becky. "Did that just happen? Did Jim Hollister, one of the biggest cattlemen in Texas, just offer us a partnership?" "I believe he did," Becky said, laughing at his expression. "Seems our luck is changing, Mr. Vance." "Our luck changed the day I collapsed on your doorstep," Ryder said, his expression softening as he gazed at her. "Everything since has just been the universe making up for all the bad luck that came before." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Hays City, with Sheriff Dawson giving the bride away and Jim Hollister standing as Ryder's best man. The partnership with Hollister proved fruitful, allowing them to expand their operations faster than they had dreamed possible. By the following spring, the Turner Vance Ranch was thriving, with a growing herd of cattle and the beginnings of what would become one of the finest horse breeding programs in Kansas. They built a larger house on the property, though Becky insisted on keeping the original homestead as well for sentimental reasons, she said. It was in that original bedroom, where she had first nursed a wounded stranger back to health, that Becky gave birth to their first child, a son they named James, after both her father and Jim Hollister, who had become like family to them. As Ryder held his newborn son, watching Becky's tired but radiant face, he marveled at how much had changed in the span of 2 years. From a wounded fugitive with nothing but the clothes on his back to a husband, father, and successful rancher, it seemed impossible, yet here he was. "What are you thinking?" Becky asked, reaching out to touch his cheek. "I'm thinking that I'm the luckiest man in Kansas," Ryder replied, leaning down to kiss her gently. "And that I thank God every day for that bullet in Dodge City that led me to you." "That's a strange thing to be thankful for," Becky teased, echoing their conversation from long ago. "Maybe," Ryder agreed with a smile, "but it's our story, and I wouldn't change a word of it." Over the years, their family and their ranch grew together. A daughter, Elizabeth, joined them 2 years after James, followed by twin boys, Samuel and Thomas, 3 years later. The Turner Vance Ranch became known throughout the territory for its quality horses and cattle, and Ryder and Becky's partnership in business and in life was held up as an example of what could be achieved with hard work and devotion. They faced challenges, of course. Droughts, harsh winters, fluctuations in the cattle market, and the occasional trouble from rustlers or unscrupulous competitors. But they faced each obstacle together, their bond only strengthening with each trial overcome. Fletcher Reed tried once more to cause trouble for them, sending men to intimidate them into selling prime grazing land he wanted for his own expanding operation. But by then, Ryder and Becky had built too strong a foundation in the community to be easily threatened. With the support of Sheriff Dawson, now retired but still influential, Jim Hollister and their many friends and neighbors, they stood their ground and Reed eventually retreated, finding easier targets elsewhere. 10 years to the day after Ryder had collapsed on Becky's doorstep, they hosted a celebration at the ranch ostensibly to mark a decade of successful operation, but privately to commemorate the beginning of their story. Friends and family gathered from near and far, including Jim Hollister, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, and several of the cowboys who had ridden with Ryder on that fateful cattle drive. As the festivities wound down and guests began to depart, Ryder found Becky standing on the porch of the old homestead, gazing out at the land they had nurtured together. The setting sun painted the prairie in gold, much as it had on countless evenings they'd shared there. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, coming to stand beside her. Becky smiled, leaning into him as his arm circled her waist. "I was thinking about fate and choices and how they intertwine. Deep thoughts for a celebration day," Ryder observed. "Happy thoughts," Becky corrected. "I was remembering how scared I was that night when I heard someone at my door, how I almost didn't go out to check." "But you did," Ryder said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You chose to help a stranger, even though it put you at risk. And you chose to trust me, even in your wounded state," Becky added. "We've been making choices that brought us closer ever since." Ryder turned her to face him, his blue eyes still as bright and captivating as the day they met, looking into hers with profound love. "Best choices I ever made." "Even better than choosing to stand up to Fletcher Reed," Becky teased. "Well, that one had mixed results," Ryder laughed. "But yes, even better than that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the horizon. In the main house, they could hear the sounds of their children being herded to bed by Becky's cousin who had come to help with the celebration. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been shot that day?" Becky asked. "If you had collected your payment without incident and ridden back to Texas?" "Sometimes," Ryder admitted. "But then I remember something my mother used to say. God works in mysterious ways. Maybe I needed to be shot and left for dead on your doorstep to find the life I was meant to have." "That's a rather extreme method of divine matchmaking," Becky said with a smile. "Perhaps," Ryder agreed, drawing her closer, "but effective, and I wouldn't change a moment of it, not even the pain, because it all led me to you." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Ryder and Becky Vance stood together on the porch of the home where their story had begun. Surrounded by the legacy they had built together, a thriving ranch, a loving family, and a bond that had been forged in the most unexpected of circumstances. From wounded stranger to beloved husband, from solitary rancher to loving wife, they had transformed each other's lives in ways neither could have imagined on that fateful night. Their story, like the vast Kansas prairie stretching out before them, contained both struggle and beauty, hardship and joy, but above all, an enduring love that had healed wounds both seen and unseen. And as they turned to walk back to their home, hand in hand under the star-filled sky, both knew with absolute certainty that this was exactly where they were meant to be.